Hey guys, tonight we drift into something strange, a question that sounds simple, but might haunt you. What if today felt completely normal, but it wasn't? The skies moved as they always do, traffic hummed, screens flickered, and people made plans for a future that quietly stopped existing. Somewhere above, time shifted, not with noise, but with stillness. Earth was spinning through its final loop around the sun, and no one knew. Not the birds, not the oceans, not even you. Until maybe, just for a moment, the stars blinked slower, like they were waiting for someone to notice that the story had ended. Before we begin, take a breath, and if you're ready to fall into the quiet, like this video, and gently subscribe. It helps keep the universe spinning. It began like any other day, the kind of morning you never remember but always live through, tucked so deep inside the folds of routine that it slips past your senses like warm air through a cracked window, a sun that rose not with glory but with obligation, spilling its golden light across rooftops, rusted satellite dishes, bus stops, window panes, and quiet bedrooms where half-open eyes blinked at the soft flicker of ceiling fans. In those rooms, the world returned in pieces, dreams breaking apart like thin ice under morning's footstep, memories rearranging themselves into tasks, alarms buzzing with the desperation of forgotten sleep, and people, barely conscious, reaching for phones before remembering their own names. Outside, the city yawned, streetlights fading into sky glow, pigeons shifting on power lines, garbage trucks moaning down empty roads, and radios playing songs that once meant something to someone but now played only because. Silence had no sponsors, and still, everything felt fine, everything looked real, everything moved the way it always did. Men tightened ties in mirrors without seeing their own faces, women tapped through weather apps while brushing their hair, children fought zippers and slumped backpacks onto shoulders that already knew tiredness, and old men on balconies watched the world like it was a film they'd seen too many times to be moved by it again. Trains hissed, tires hummed, coffee machines blinked to life, shoes clicked against pavement, and in thousands of kitchens, toast burned slightly as it always did, because normal has a scent, and it's slightly overdone bread, and no one, not one soul, noticed the strange slowness hiding beneath the minute hand, the way time felt soft around the edges, like a story being told by someone who had forgotten why they began telling it in the first place. Birds flew, but not far. Clouds drifted, but not fast. Voices echoed, but didn't travel. And above it all, past the concrete and metal, past the blue sky pretending nothing was different, past even the satellites that blinked obediently in their pre-programmed circuits, something shifted, silently, so delicately that it could not be measured by any human instrument, only felt in the way you feel a glance on your back when no one's behind you, or a name you've forgotten whispering just behind your memory. It wasn't darkness, or doom, or fire in the sky, it was something far older and quieter, a sacred stillness in the breath of the planet, as if Earth itself had paused for the briefest moment to wonder whether it wanted to keep turning. And yet, no one stopped, not the barista writing names she didn't hear, not the taxi driver waiting at a red light that felt longer than usual, not the boy staring out the window of a classroom already dreaming of afternoon. Because everything continued. The illusion held strong, bills were due, traffic needed dodging, meetings waited behind glass doors, and people, built from habits and held together by momentum, chose the comfort of blindness over the terror of asking what this hush in the bones might mean. The clocks ticked in their steady treason, the screens lit up with fresh distractions, and even the air seemed to collaborate in the deception. Breeze just warm enough to feel real, sky just blue enough to believe in, birdsong just cheerful enough to dismiss the unease. And so the world moved forward, confidently. Unaware, as it always had, never stopping to ask if this rising sun felt less like a beginning and more like the echo of one, never wondering why the light seemed thinner, or the shadows longer, or the silence in the spaces between sounds slightly more awake than it should be. Somewhere deep within the earth, something ancient shifted in its sleep, something the rocks remembered but language had long since forgotten, and still, not a single person looked up, not a single face turned skyward to see whether the heavens had blinked, or breathed, or whispered a goodbye too gentle to hear. And somewhere in all that forward motion, in all that routine and comfort and momentum, the planet spun a fraction slower, like a dancer considering her final step, and no one noticed that this day, this ordinary, invisible, forgettable day, might be the last time the world would ever feel this familiar again. There was no warning. No trembling in the ground, no flicker in the sky, no broadcasted emergency, no flashing red bar beneath the news, and yet, something had changed, something small enough to slip beneath language, but large enough to bend the mood of reality itself. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't stop hearts or shatter glass or send people running into the streets. No, it was subtler than that, the kind of shift only the silence notices first, like the way shadows clung too tightly to the ground, refusing to flutter with the breeze, or the way light fell through windows a little too slow, as if it had forgotten how to be fast. The wind touched skin but disappeared before it could be felt, like a ghost unsure of its welcome, and the temperature of everything became uncertain, not warm or cold, but paused in some in-between place, like the earth was waiting to decide whether to wake up or sleep forever. The clocks kept ticking, mechanically loyal, but the seconds between the ticks felt stretched, as if time had decided to take the long way around. Not forward, not backward, but sideways, diagonally, into itself, and people, without knowing why, began to feel it in strange ways. A man stopped mid-stride on a staircase, suddenly unsure whether he was going up or down. A woman forgot what day it was, then forgot why that mattered. A child stared at a spoon and asked if metal could dream. Even the animals sensed it. A dog barked into an empty hallway, then stared like it expected something to answer back. Birds flapped once and then spiraled in place, their wings unsure of direction. Trees didn't sway, they waited, and the sky, wide and pale, held a kind of breathless expression, like it knew something no one else did. And still, people continued, convincing themselves it was just one of those days, a strange feeling, a passing fog, because the world was still running, wasn't it? The phone still rang, the emails still sent, the coffee still brewed, the traffic still crawled, and yet, beneath all of it, beneath the asphalt and the floors and the shoes and the lives, the soul of the world had taken one small step away from itself, not loudly, not violently, but gently, like a record skipping, not enough to break the song, but just enough to make you feel like the rhythm had forgotten your name, and the world, your world, wasn't quite where you left it anymore. People went to work, and nothing stopped them, not the strange light hanging in the air like an old photograph, not the feeling that the world had blinked and forgotten to open its eyes again, because habit is louder than instinct, and in a world built on repetition, the body moves long after the soul begins to hesitate. So they boarded trains, adjusted their rearview mirrors, walked the same cracked sidewalks with bags over their shoulders and earbuds in their ears, shuffling past each other with the blank choreography of a civilization pretending not to notice that something was off. The traffic lights still changed, the vending machines still buzzed, the weather still gave reports that felt increasingly irrelevant, and yet, beneath it all, there was this strange undercurrent, like the soundtrack of the day had warped slightly, a note too low, a rhythm just misaligned enough to make your stomach lurch if you were paying attention, which most people weren't, because emails still had to be answered, and meetings still had to be sat through, and everything still looked like it was supposed to, even if it didn't feel like it belonged anymore. There was a man who ordered his coffee and forgot his name when the barista asked for it, and laughed to cover the pause, not because it was funny, but because it was easier than admitting the truth, that names, words, days were beginning to slip like water through hands that could no longer close into fists. A woman stepped into an elevator and couldn't remember what floor she lived on, not because of stress or distraction, but because for a moment, her life felt like a place she hadn't visited in years. Children stared at their classrooms as if they'd entered someone else's dream, and maybe they had, because nothing inside those rooms felt entirely real anymore. The chalk smell, the flicker of the projector, the teacher's voice all seemed muffled, like echoes from a cave far deeper than any school had reason to reach. And somewhere, in the center of this unraveling, the sky stretched over the earth like a painted sheet, blue, calm, seemingly solid, but too smooth, too perfect, like someone had drawn it from memory rather than light, and people walking beneath it felt something stir at the back of their minds, like a song they once knew but could no longer hum, a language they once spoke in dreams but forgot upon waking. There were conversations that started and never found their endings, stories told twice by people who didn't remember telling them the first time, and laughter that felt too loud in rooms that were too quiet, because something was off, something subtle, like the color of time had faded and no one had the eyes to notice. Clocks ticked, but they ticked with hesitation, as if asking permission, and the reflections in mirrors took a heartbeat too long to catch up, and the wind passed through crowds without lifting a single strand of hair. In the forests, animals moved cautiously, their ears twitching at frequencies humans no longer remembered how to hear, and in the cities, the pigeons circled, not because they were lost, but because they were trying to remember how the sky used to feel. Even technology seemed unsure of itself, phones freezing for a breath, lights flickering not from power surges, but doubt, as if even the wires and circuits that ran the world felt the glitch in the center of it. And still, the people moved, because it was easier to obey the calendar. Then question the silence, easier to keep going than ask what they were moving toward, and yet, the world beneath their feet had grown hollow, not broken, not cracked, just less real, as if the floor was made of story now instead of stone, and every step echoed not in air, but memory. Somewhere, a child paused in the middle of coloring a sun and asked her mother, "What if tomorrow doesn't happen?" Not afraid, not dramatic, just curious, and her mother smiled too quickly, because no one wants to admit that some questions feel more like prophecies than thoughts. And all through that day, through blinking screens and flickering eyes and shallow breaths, there pulsed a low, steady echo, a hum beneath existence, like the world was remembering a song it never learned, a farewell it never said, and somewhere, just outside the reach of language, the earth itself whispered a phrase no one could quite hear, but everyone, somehow, understood. As the afternoon gave way to that fragile hour when light begins to lose its grip and everything starts to look like a memory, the sky began to behave like something that had just woken up, not in the sense of color or weather, but in presence, in personality, in the quiet, terrifying way that a sleeping giant might open one eye and silently watch the world that forgot it was ever alive, and for the first time in countless generations. People started looking upward not out of habit, or beauty, or weather-checking routine, but because they felt something up there looking back. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't peace either. It was that slow, cold whisper that passes through your chest when someone you didn't know was watching you speaks your name, a sudden, ancestral awareness that the ceiling of our lives, the vast expanse we've painted with satellites, planes, and predictions, was never truly empty, that it had always been more than atmosphere, more than chemistry and clouds, more than weather maps and filtered sunsets. It had been watching, breathing, waiting, and we just hadn't noticed. And now, something in the very texture of the sky had changed. It didn't roll or drift or stretch like it used to. It pulsed, softly, like lungs beneath linen, slow and steady and ancient, as if it had taken a single, deliberate inhale and was holding it, just holding it, waiting to see what we would do. And the clouds, once casual and carefree, now hovered like frozen thoughts, hanging in arrangements that didn't belong to any season, casting shadows that moved too slowly across the ground, like hesitant fingers touching the earth for what might be the last time. The light, too, had shifted, no longer golden or blue or soft or sharp, but instead something in between, something reflective, as if the air itself had turned into water and the whole sky was looking at its own reflection in our eyes. And people everywhere, in quiet unison, began to slow down, not because they understood, but because their bodies remembered something their minds did not, that the sky has moods, that silence is not the same as stillness, and that when the heavens go quiet for this long, they are almost always listening. And so, across the world, in parking lots and office chairs and kitchen windows, people glanced upward without knowing why, pausing for one heartbeat too long, feeling that strange stretch in time where the present becomes heavy, almost sticky, like it's struggling to stay real, and someone on a rooftop whispered, "It feels like the sky is trying to remember us," and somewhere else, a woman standing in traffic murmured, "No, it's not memory, it's recognition." And though no one could agree, they all felt the same invisible pressure, like being inside a glass room slowly filling with water, not dangerous yet, but inevitable. Even animals looked up, even trees tilted their leaves toward the clouds, and in the oceans, beneath the surface, entire schools of fish shifted direction in perfect silence, as though something above them had turned its gaze downward, and still, the world kept spinning, but slower now. Or at least it felt slower, like every second had to pull itself forward through syrup-thick air, and nothing, not screens, not music, not words, could distract from the deep, echoing realization that this sky, this breathing, watching, remembering sky, was no longer just a background. It was a character now, a witness, maybe even a judge, and all we could do was pretend we hadn't noticed. Pretend we hadn't heard the exhale we all felt in our bones, pretend that the sky hadn't just blinked. For the first time in 1,000 years, because if we stopped pretending, if we acknowledged it, we'd have to ask what it meant, and worse, what comes next. Evening arrived not like a curtain falling but like something dissolving, slowly, around the edges, the air growing thicker, not darker, just heavier, like it was saturated with questions too old to translate, and somewhere between the slipping light and the long shadows, a new kind of hunger settled over the world, not in the belly, not in the mouth, but in the chest, in the soles of the feet, in the backs of necks and the base of spines, an ache that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with absence. It came not from lack but from forgetting, as if something vital had already been taken and the body was just now realizing it was missing. People felt it without knowing where to put it, a restlessness that didn't want motion, an emptiness that didn't want filling, a quiet ache that throbbed not with pain but with recognition, and so they began to move without purpose, down streets they didn't need to walk, standing in doorways they hadn't planned to pass through, staring at buildings like they were pages in a book they once read in a dream, their eyes hollow not with grief but with longing, a longing for what, they didn't know, only that the world now felt like a house someone had already moved out of, and they were only just noticing the echo in every room. People turned off their phones, not because they were tired, but because the sounds coming from them suddenly felt fake, like someone trying to impersonate human life, and so they sat in silence, or wandered without destination, their movements slow, uncertain, as if trying to hear footsteps in a hallway that no longer existed. Even color began to fade, not disappear, but weaken. Traffic lights looked too clean, like props. Neon signs flickered with just enough delay to feel wrong, and even the sky, that old canvas of comfort, now resembled a painting no one could agree on, familiar, but faded, like someone had whispered descriptions of it long ago and we were only pretending to remember what blue really looked like. Time, too, grew soft, hours stretched without meaning, moments folded into each other like pages missing their numbers, and somewhere, maybe on a rooftop or an empty bus stop or a grocery store parking lot bathed in artificial light, someone whispered, without knowing why, "I don't think this day wants to end," and though no one heard them, the feeling passed through every heart like a gentle tremor, like a warning in a language older than fear, and the earth beneath their feet, quiet, watching, waiting, seemed to breathe just a little deeper, as if feeding on the stillness we left behind while we kept pretending that everything, somehow, was still okay. Long before any scientist published a graph, before any clock skipped a beat or any sky cracked open, the animals knew, not through logic or prophecy, but through that ancient channel of instinct we once shared but traded away for convenience and distraction, and so they began to act strange, not in loud, chaotic ways, but in quiet refusals that should have made us pause. Cats stared at corners for hours, unblinking, not hunting, just watching, not something, but through something, as if a veil had thinned and they could now see past the edges of this unraveling world, while dogs, normally ecstatic for the open air, began digging in corners of their homes, circling spots on the floor as if sensing places where the ground felt hollow, where the earth was remembering how to open its mouth. In the forests, deer froze in clearings not because of danger but because of awareness, because something beneath the soil had shifted in tone, in breath, in memory, and even the wildest among them knew that to move now would be to misstep inside a dream too fragile to walk through. Birds no longer traced elegant arcs in the sky, they flew lower, slower, as though the atmosphere had become heavy, almost mournful, or like they were searching for something that used to be there and now was not. And the bees, the frantic scribes of summer, began to slow, their dizzy urgency replaced with a kind of silent hovering, as if trying to remember what work was for when the flowers had forgotten how to bloom fully. Even the insects, those eternal whispers of the ground, went still, their chorus silenced not by season but by sensation, some invisible note in the air that told them the rhythm had changed. Whales changed their migratory paths, turning without reason across entire oceans, like some ancient song had shifted its key, and wolves, those midnight poets of the wilderness, stopped howling, not out of fear, but reverence, like singers lowering their voices in the presence of something older than sound itself. Somewhere in the mountains, a fox sat still on a ridge and watched the horizon for hours without blinking, and somewhere in the heart of a sleeping city, a single crow landed in front of a child on a playground and didn't move, didn't twitch, didn't blink, just watched, calmly, knowingly, like a message sent without paper or sound, and the child, too young to doubt their senses, simply stared back, unafraid, as if some ancient treaty had just been remembered. Zoos fell strangely silent. Farms reported animals refusing to eat, and across the world, people kept brushing these signs aside, blaming the weather, or pollution, or stress, because it was easier than admitting that maybe, just maybe, the world had already begun to fold, not collapse or crumble, not explode or scream, just fold, quietly, inward, like the last page of a book being turned by hands that didn't need to touch anything to move it, and all around us, the wild things were the first to notice, the only ones still connected to that invisible thread between heartbeat and earth, between bone and time, the only ones still listening to the breath of the planet, and if anyone had paused long enough, if anyone had really watched them, they might have seen it too, the way the animals weren't panicking, they were preparing. When night finally came, it came not with darkness but with a strange hush, as if the planet had dipped just slightly beneath the surface of something deeper than air. And though the cities still glowed with all their synthetic fire, all their traffic lights blinking and screens flickering and towers humming with invisible signals, the sound of it all dimmed. Cars still moved, headlights slicing through the streets like silent ghosts, but the wheels didn't roar, the engines didn't growl, they glided, like scenes from a memory rather than machines from the present. And music still played behind glass windows and half-drawn curtains, but the bass no longer thumped, no longer rattled bones or stirred dance floors, it just existed like a whisper pretending to be a rhythm. In restaurants, people spoke, even laughed, but their laughter no longer bounced off the walls, it fell short, as though embarrassed to be heard. Like even joy had been told to keep its voice down, and across the cities, in cafes, parks, high-rises, rooftops, and sidewalks, it became impossible to shake the feeling that everything had become muffled. Not like cotton in the ears or a volume turned low, but like the world itself had sunk ever so slightly underwater, and sound, poor thing, was trying to decide if it still belonged here. Phones vibrated without ringing. Wind moved leaves without rustling them, footsteps made the motion of echoing but didn't, and people began to notice, not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, like turning to speak and realizing the person beside you is already gone. Someone on a balcony whispered that the stars looked closer tonight, almost near enough to touch, and someone else replied that the moon seemed disappointed, like a mother watching her children break something sacred again. And yet, no one looked up for long, because the longer you stared, the more you felt it, that thick, sacred quiet pressing down from above and curling up from below, like the world was asking, softly but firmly, to be left alone. Conversations grew shorter, eye contact flickered, and even time seemed to lean back into itself, not stopping, not reversing, just hesitating, like a breath held just before sleep. And in that breath, in that strange, global hush, the planet felt impossibly large and suddenly intimate, like standing in an empty theater long after the show has ended, the stage still lit, the seats still warm, but no audience left to applaud or explain what the story had been about, just the soft, fading noise of something that used to be loud, used to be alive, now shrinking gently into memory, not broken, not screaming, just finished. It began with the smallest tremble, not in the earth, but in the heart, a soft, unspoken tug that pulled people toward their phones, not with urgency, but with tenderness, like a gentle hand on the shoulder of the soul. And one by one, across cities, villages, lonely kitchens, and crowded subways, people began sending messages they didn't entirely understand. I love you, to someone they hadn't spoken to in years. I miss you, to someone who no longer remembered their name. I'm sorry. Sent without explanation, like an apology to time itself. Thank you, typed with tears in the corners of tired eyes. And, are you okay? Sent not out of fear but out of some sacred instinct to make sure someone else was still real, still here, still breathing in the same soft unraveling universe. And no one could explain why they were doing it, because there was no headline, no war, no explosion, no fire. Just this invisible pressure, this gentle but relentless weight in the chest that whispered, over and over, that time was not something we owned, only something we borrowed. In offices, people stopped typing mid-sentence and texted their mothers. In coffee shops, people stared at their screens after hitting send, as if waiting for silence to respond. And somewhere, a man put down his phone after sending a single word, still? To someone he hadn't heard from in a decade, and didn't expect to, because this wasn't about replies, this was about release. And in this soft flood of unscheduled communication, something beautiful happened. Hearts cracked open, not from grief, but from permission. Permission to speak without reason, to feel without explanation, to say the things that had waited too long beneath the skin. Someone posted a voice note that just said, "Thank you for being alive at the same time as me, and no." One found it strange. It felt like something everyone had almost said once, in a dream. Somewhere, an old man took off his watch, stared at it for a long time, and then threw it into the river without ceremony, as if telling time to go ahead without him. Somewhere else, a little girl buried her favorite toy under the biggest tree she could find, whispering a goodbye only the leaves understood. And across the world, people held hands tighter, lingered longer in doorways, and looked at each other not like strangers or friends, but like travelers on the same quiet boat, floating toward an unknown morning that maybe wouldn't come, because somewhere in the soul of everyone still awake, there flickered the same quiet knowing. Not fear, not doom, but a softness, a closing of curtains, a breath between pages, that maybe tomorrow wasn't promised, that maybe today was the last time light would fall this gently on a human face, and that maybe, just maybe, this silence was not empty at all, but full of all the words we were finally brave enough to say. It was around midnight when the world began to grow impossibly still, not in a frightening way, not like silence before a storm, but like a long exhale after a lifetime of holding breath, and slowly, without command or cause, people across the planet began to sleep, not because they were tired, not because the hour demanded it, but because the earth asked them to. Softly, like a lullaby heard from beneath the floorboards of reality, the air thickened into a gentle heaviness, not oppressive but comforting, like a blanket being pulled across the stars, and the sky, once endless, once watching, now felt close, like the curved ceiling of a vast bedroom no longer pretending to be endless. The clocks, once arrogant in their ticking, now ticked as if each second was a whisper being laid to rest, and dreams, those flickering mirrors of the soul, arrived faster than usual, blooming beneath closed eyelids like memories returning home. And even the ones who feared the dark, who left on hallway lights, who clutched blankets like armor, felt no need to fight it anymore, because the darkness tonight wasn't empty, it was full of something gentle, something sacred, as if time itself had placed its tired head in the lap of the universe and finally allowed itself to drift. And no one panicked, no alarms rang, no warnings flashed, because it wasn't fear that filled the night now, it was something far older and far deeper. Acceptance, not surrender, but softness, like a song humming itself out of existence, like the warmth that lingers in a room after someone has left it. In quiet rooms, people turned to each other and simply whispered, "I'm glad," without needing to explain what they meant, and those alone didn't feel lonely, not tonight, because the night itself felt personal, like it was holding them, watching them, cradling them in some invisible rhythm that no longer needed explanation. And time, the great engine behind every breath, every story, every heartbeat, seemed to slow not from weariness, but from peace, like a clock deciding it had ticked long enough and deserved, finally, to be still. Seconds lengthened into silence, hours folded into memory, and across the turning earth, beneath that sleeping sky, everything felt like it was curling inwards, not dying, not ending, but resting, deeply, as if the whole world had finally remembered that it, too, was allowed to sleep. High above the sleeping earth, past clouds that no longer drift but simply hover like held breaths, the stars began to blink slower, not to the naked eye, not in a way clocks could measure, but in the quiet, sacred rhythm of something ancient preparing to rest, like heartbeats slowing in a body that has finally stopped resisting sleep. They pulsed like memories instead of lights, like soft, golden sighs across the black fabric of forever. And the satellites that once darted through them, those fast, blinking witnesses of humanity's reach, now drifted quietly, their paths unmonitored, unimportant, as if they too had grown tired of watching. The Milky Way stretched wider, gentler, not with power but with longing, like an arm trying to cradle the universe one last time, pulling every light, every shadow, every silence into its embrace. And down below, in houses and forests, on rooftops and deserts, people slept more deeply than they ever had before. Not with exhaustion but with trust, falling inward into dreams that no longer belonged to them alone, dreams shared like ancient water from a common well. And in those dreams they saw things they never knew they needed, glimpses of cities that never were but somehow felt like home, oceans that spoke in color, children not yet born walking hand in hand with ancestors long returned to the soil, and faces that looked like love without names, without time, and all of it felt real, not in the waking world sense, but in the soul sense, in that deeper place where truth doesn't need facts to be believed. And the sky, once a ceiling, once a dome of unreachable stars and scientific wonder, now revealed itself for what it had always truly been, not a boundary, but a doorway, a soft glowing threshold to somewhere else, somewhere the mind can't carry luggage, only stillness. And as the stars blinked slower and slower, it no longer felt like time was passing. It felt like time was saying goodbye, gently. Like someone closing a book they loved, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it had ended exactly when it needed to. Just before dawn, not quite night, not yet morning, a strange and ancient kind of peace settled over the entire planet, as if the Earth, after spinning for billions of years, had finally been told it could pause, just for a moment, just long enough to listen. And in that moment, nothing moved. Not the trees that usually danced with morning wind, not the birds that would chirp their hymns to waking light, not the clouds, not the insects, not the hum of machines or even the distant static of restless cities. Everything stilled, everything softened, as though the entire world had collectively taken one final, shared inhale, the kind that isn't rushed or fearful, but full of memory, full of love, full of all the tiny, quiet things that never made it into history books but made life worth remembering. The way a child's laughter echoes in a hallway, the way rain smells when it touches dry earth, the warmth of someone's hand in yours without a single word needing to be said, and in that breath, that sacred, slow, unspeakably still breath, the earth felt loved, not for what it had given, not for what it had survived, but simply because it had been. It had held us, hurt us, healed us, forgiven us, again and again, and we, despite everything, despite all the forgetting, had loved it back in ways too quiet to measure, in gardens, in lullabies, in the way we looked at sunsets when we thought no one was watching. And so this breath, this pause that stretched across the sky like the soft pulling in of the soul, became something more than silence, more than air. It became memory, the oldest one, the very first one, remembered backwards, like the world was looking over its shoulder before stepping beyond the edge of time. And if anyone had been awake in that moment, truly awake, they would have felt it too, not as an ending, but as the most sacred kind of goodbye. The kind you whisper when your heart is too full for sound. And then, it came, not like a miracle, not like a warning, but like a promise being kept quietly after everyone had stopped watching. The last sunrise, soft and unannounced, rising over the curve of the earth, not with fire, not with ceremony, but with a gentleness so complete it felt like love. Not the kind shouted from rooftops or written in poems, but the kind that watches over you in silence when you sleep. It didn't blaze, it didn't scream, it didn't crack open the sky with triumph or terror. It just rose, like a candle being lit in the center of a quiet room, flickering not with urgency but with understanding, with farewell. And that light, warm and golden and impossibly soft, touched everything one last time. The oceans that had carried us, the trees that had shaded us, the rooftops of houses still holding the dreams of children, and the closed eyes of billions who slept not from fatigue but from completion. Because nothing needed them to wake anymore. The world didn't end in fire, or flood, or ice, or war. It ended in stillness, in grace, in that rare and sacred space where nothing has to happen next, where the need to begin again has finally, gently, dissolved. And the sun, that ancient witness to everything we ever were, every joy, every wound, every birth, every goodbye, rose not out of duty this time, but out of memory, just to look one last time at the planet it had loved from afar. And for the first time since time began, it did not hurry, it did not climb, it just hovered there. On the horizon, watching, holding, glowing, not to wake the world, but to bless it, and in that golden, endless pause, Earth became not a place, but a memory, warm, still, held forever in the light of a morning that would never have to end. Somewhere deep in the fabric of the cosmos, far beyond numbers and names and maps we once trusted, a single planet turned one last time, not in pain, not in resistance, but in peace, like a dancer finishing her final slow spin before the music fades into the floorboards. And that turning, that last gentle motion, carried not bodies or cities or sound, but memory, the laughter of children chasing kites through wind, the softness of rain slipping down old stone, the trembling of first kisses in quiet doorways, the wars, yes, and the fire, but also the rebuilding, the forgiveness, the arms that held what couldn't be fixed. It held oceans that once swallowed moons in myth, songs that never made it to radios, names whispered over graves, bread broken between enemies who no longer remembered why they fought, and the eyes of strangers meeting across buses and realizing, for just a second, they weren't alone. It carried the quiet revolutions, mothers humming their children to sleep, fathers fixing things no one would notice, artists drawing futures that would never come, and it held silence too, the holy kind, the kind that speaks louder than sound, the kind that comes when there's nothing more to prove, nothing more to explain, and when the turning stopped, not abruptly, but like a sigh slipping between stars, there was no fire, no collapse, no warning, there was only stillness, complete and golden, like the very idea of movement had gone to sleep, no credits rolled. No voice declared the end, because the story didn't need one, it had been told, lived, felt, broken, healed, and finally, finished, and above it all, scattered like ancient thoughts across the black ocean of space, the stars blinked slowly, not in mourning, not in celebration, but in quiet remembrance, like friends who'd watched from a distance and stayed long enough to say goodbye, and now, had nothing left to add. They didn't speak. They simply stayed, dimming one by one, not disappearing. Just fading, as if even the sky understood that some lights aren't meant to last forever, only long enough to remind you they once burned.